Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to Stately Von Manor, where Roger and I have returned for my weekend reading report. It's time for my weekend reading report. This is the thrill-packed program where I talk about all the exciting stuff that I read during the previous week. I mean, you can't get more exciting than that. And this past week, I had a couple days off. I had a few days off, actually. So I was able to read more than I'm usually able to. So a little bit more than usual in today's reading report. Roger, are you ready? Look how thrilled Roger is. He can't wait to talk about all this exciting stuff. Okay, the stuff that I read this past week. In my 500 book challenge, the challenge where I have to read 500 books that I own before I'll buy any new ones, book number 123 was the Holmes Dracula file. The Holmes Dracula file. This is a book by Fred Saberhagen. This is the second book in his Dracula series. He wrote 10 books in this series, I believe, if you don't count his film adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula. He wrote 10 books, and this is the second one. I read the first one last year, the Dracula tape. That was really good. And this one was really good as well. This one co-stars Sherlock Holmes. And in this book, Sherlock Holmes and Dracula eventually team up to defeat some nefarious villains who have a dastardly plot. And the dastardly plot is a fairly familiar one. In fact, I just read a book not too long ago. It was a pulp novel from the Spider magazine. It was the Spider, I think it was the third issue of the Spider, and it was it Wings of Death or Black Wings of Death or something? Anyway, that Spider novel, the nefarious villains in that novel had the same evil plot that the villains in this book do. And that's okay. It's okay. The fun is watching Sherlock Holmes and Dracula try to defeat these villains and stop this terrible thing from happening, which the villains are planning, and it's fun. So the Dracula in this book is Fred Saberhagen's Dracula, which is a different Dracula than the Dracula from Bram Stoker's novel. In fact, the first book in Fred Saberhagen's series is all about Dracula trying to set the record straight. And to say, hey, see, I'm not such a bad guy. I'm not so bad. He's an unreliable narrator, Dracula. So the Dracula in this book isn't quite the same Dracula, but he's still, you know, he's enough of Dracula to make it fun. And then, of course, Sherlock Holmes, and the Sherlock Holmes sections in this book, you know, they're narrated by Watson, as is proper. They were done very well. Saberhagen does a really good job of imitating Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. And even though there is a bit in this book where they go into Sherlock Holmes' backstory and a bit of his family history, which is ridiculous. The startling revelations about Sherlock Holmes' family history in this book are just preposterous and silly, which seems to be a common thing that you find in Sherlock Holmes pastiche fiction. Very often you'll just find some, you know, they'll bring up Sherlock Holmes' family or some deep, dark part of his past to explain the way he is, and it's usually pretty ridiculous. And it's ridiculous in this book as well, but that's okay. It's still a lot of fun. This book is a lot of fun, and I do highly recommend it. It's fun. So that was the Holmes Dracula file. I recommend that book. It's good stuff. Then, book number 124 was The Mighty Thor by Walter Simonson, Volume 1. And that was the first paperback collection of Thor from Walter Simonson. And I finished that. I have that on my Magic tablet. I don't have, at the moment, any of Simonson's Thor issues in physical copies. I just have them on my tablet. Right now, because I'm reading every issue of Thor, and I don't have them all in physical copies. So I'm at issue 351, Walt Simonson's Thor. Awesome stuff. It's great. It's great. So I'm on the second volume of Walt Simonson's Thor. Just amazing stuff. Just great. So yeah, that's Thor. And yeah, look at that. It's just, this is the high point, I think, of Thor. I'm starting to like this stuff even more than I did the Jack Kirby Stan Lee stuff, which is saying something. So yeah, there's that. I read that. Then book number 125 is a book that I was not planning on reading, but I was watching a video from the channel Mystery and Mayhem, which I highly recommend. I'll link it down below. And I saw this book pop up, and I was kind of surprised. This is Ancient Myths, written by Norma Laurie Goodrich, which is a retelling of a bunch of different myths from around the world. And I got this book for free somewhere. It was either in a little free library or maybe the El Cerrito Recycling Center or someplace where you get free books. I got this book for free at some point. It's just been a long time and I don't remember exactly where. But I saw this and I thought, I have that. I need to pull that out and read that. So I did, and it was a lot of fun. These are very well told, these retellings of ancient myths. And we have ancient myths in here from somewhere. We have Gilgamesh. We have Horus the Hawk from Egypt. We've got myths from Crete and Greece, Troy, Persia and Afghanistan, India, and Rome. And there's a lot of good stuff in here. It's not a comprehensive collection of myths. It's just, a few random myths that have been retold for this volume. And it's a lot of fun. This was a good book. It was a nice change of pace. So, Ancient Myths by Norma Laurie Goodrich. If you ever see this book lying around anywhere, pick it up. It's good. I recommend it. So there was that. Then, book 126 in the 500 book challenge was Signs of Chaos from the Great Book of Amber. This gigantic book has all 10 of the Amber books in it. And I've been reading the Amber books at the recommendation of Grammaticus, the fantastic booktube channel Grammaticus. I had this book lying around forever, and then Grammaticus finally got me to read this series. And I'm really glad that he did, because this is great stuff. And Signs of Chaos, which is the third book, the third book in the Merlin cycle, is really, really good. It's as good as the first couple books in the cycle were. The Merlin cycle, the plot of this series of books isn't as complex or interesting as the Corwin cycle, which is the initial cycle in the Amber series. But I like the character of Merlin a lot. I like that. I like this character Merlin a lot. So it's fun to read these. It's just great stuff. And Signs of Chaos was a really enjoyable book. Right smack dab in the middle of this cycle, the Merlin cycle, and it's excellent. I'll talk more about the Merlin cycle when I finally finish it. I've got 2 books left in the Great Book of Amber, the Amber Chronicles. Really have enjoyed this fantasy series a lot. I'm really surprised that I never read this before. It took me this long to read this stuff, but catching up now, awesome. If you've never read the Amber Chronicles, you should read them. So I read that this week, and that was fun. It was just a wee little book. It was wee. It was small, but fun. So I read that, and I read a couple other things, which I'll do now. I picked this up, Tales from the Crypt, the EC Archives Volume 1 of Tales from the Crypt. So I've decided to finally start reading all of the EC archives that I have I have most of them in physical. Well, I don't have most of them. I have a lot of them in physical copies. Most of them I have as e-copies, which I picked up. Most of them back in the day when Comixology was still around. Remember those glorious days? But I have quite a few physical copies as well, and so I figure I'm just going to read through Tales of the Crypt, and then I'll move on to like the Vault of Horror and all that other stuff. So Tales of the Crypt, Volume 1, I read the first 2 issues from this, which was when the comic was called The Crypt of Terror. So the first issue of Tales from the Crypt was called The Crypt of Terror. And it starts off with issue number 17 because it picks up the numbering system from a former comic book, which was a crime suspense comic book. And so in the first couple issues of The Crypt of Terror, the first couple issues actually have a lot of crime stories in them, with maybe 1 or 2 horror stories in there. But they decided to shift over to horror. But we really don't start getting to a lot of horror until this issue right there, which is the 3rd issue. And then they really start to cut loose with the horror. Even so, this volume, it's pretty tame compared to the stuff that comes later. EC Comics, they really went wild with their horror comics, and they were magnificent. EC Comics, I still consider the greatest comic book company that ever existed. Just wonderful stuff. Not so much in this volume, but they get to being pretty great pretty quickly. So I decided I'm going to read all of it. I've had it lying around. I've got this 500 book challenge I have to get through. Might as well read them. So yeah, starting to read this. Read the first couple issues out of that. I'll read more of this today. It's fun stuff. I also read out of this. I've just been reading all kinds of stuff. I read the very first issue of Marvel Comics from the Golden Age. So these are the very first issues of any Marvel Comics superheroes, which is from the Golden Age. This predates the Marvel Age, when Stan Lee brought in all of co-created all of the original Marvel superheroes, starting with the Fantastic Four with Jack Kirby. But this is the Marvel Comics Omnibus. It has all of these issues of Marvel Comics, which became Marvel Mystery Comics. And it's a ton of fun. So I read the first issue out of this, and it has the first appearance of the original Human Torch, and Submariner makes his initial appearance here, and a bunch of characters that are completely forgotten, like the Angel. And a lot of fun. It's good stuff. I'm not a huge fan of the Golden Age compared to the Silver and Bronze Age comics, but this stuff is really fun. And it's highly entertaining to see the Human Torch, which is an android created by a scientist who looks completely human, only he will burst into flame. You know, when oxygen hits him, he just bursts into flame. For no reason. The scientist who created him has no idea why this is happening. Eventually, he's able to control his flame, the Human Torch. But in the Human Torch's initial series, or initial story, he's kind of a psychopath and ends up killing a bunch of people. You know, if you're a criminal, you don't want to mess with superheroes back in 1939, because they'll just up and kill you. I mean, he literally boils some criminals to death who are in a swimming pool. It's grisly stuff. Human Torch, man, don't mess with him. And then the Submariner is pretty much a terrorist in his first outing. So there's that. And the Angel, oh my goodness. The Angel is this character that nobody remembers, but he just up and slaughters people. I mean, yeah, lots of killing. Lots of indiscriminate killing from our superheroes in 1939. But it was fun. I'm going to go through these issues probably kind of slowly, just whenever I get the chance. So what am I reading right now, other than Thor? Right now, I am reading And this also wasn't on my TBR, but I decided to just go ahead and read it. This is Mythago Wood by Robert Holdstock. I'm reading this right now. I am 128 pages. Yeah, 128 pages into this book. I wasn't going to read this book this week, but I did this video about all the classic fantasy books I want to read, and this was on there. This was on the list. And a couple viewers are like, you've got to read this because this has been on your TBR forever. My friend Salty Walt, the salty one, said, I told you to read this years ago. You should read that book. And I'm like, you're right. I'll pick it up and read it. And so I did. And it's good. It's really good, which doesn't surprise me. What does surprise me about this book is that it reads a lot more like a horror novel so far than a fantasy novel. This feels very much like a folk horror book because it's just full of scary, terrifying things and scary creatures lurking in the woods and coming out of the woods. And they're called Mythagos, hence the title Mythago Wood. And I can't tell you what a Mythago is without kind of spoiling part of the story. And we have this guy who was in the war. He was in World War II. And he grew up in this lodge by these woods. And his father dies. And so he's living in this village in France, but he goes back home to the lodge where his brother is living. And his brother seems to have, something's happened to his brother. He seems to be going crazy. And his father was obsessed with the woods, the forest that they live next to, and seemed to have gone insane and then died. And his brother seems to be going a little nuts too. And frankly, the main character in the story seems a little bit unstable himself. It's interesting. And these things in the woods, the Mythagos, they're just terrifying. This book is full of scary stuff. And so it feels a lot like a horror novel. So maybe it'll seem more, I mean, it is fantasy, and maybe it'll seem more fantasy as I go through it. But right now, it's just like, man, why are you staying here? Go back to France. And then he starts a relationship, or he seems to be starting a relationship, our main character, with this, well, I won't be able to pronounce her name, so let's just call her the stinky girl from the woods. He begins a relationship with the stinky girl from the woods because she's a Mythago. And Mythagos apparently never bathe. And so she just lives in the forest, never takes a bath, and is just really stinky. And she comes into his house when he's not around, and she rummages through his stuff. And so he knows she's been there because his stuff is all moved around, and she steals his food. And at one point there's a chicken coop, and she goes and kills a couple chickens and carries them away. So she's creepy, all right? She's creepy. But he just thinks she's the hottest thing, the stinky girl from the woods, even though she reeks, But I get it. He's in his early 20s. She's the only girl in this. She's the only female character in this book up to this point who's still alive. So maybe it doesn't matter that she smells like old socks or worse. So yeah, a romance with a stinky girl in the woods and a bunch of terrifying creatures. So this is good so far. I'm enjoying it. There's some disturbing things in this book, but it's fun, and I will give you a full report after I finished reading this. But yeah, everybody told me this book was really good, and this book is really good. So I'll tell you more when I'm done. I did get a couple things that showed up here at the Manor. I am still buying Epic collections. That's the one thing that's exempt from the 500 book challenge. And I got this one. This is Captain America, Epic Collection, Volume 6, The Man Who Sold the United States. This has issues of Captain America from 1974 through 1976. And this starts off when, Captain America was all disillusioned. So he gave up his Captain America identity, and he becomes the ridiculous nomad. Look at that costume. He decides to just change his superhero identity and become nomad, with this very 1970s costume. Fortunately, he doesn't stay nomad very long. And then the first thing he does practically is trip on his cape, which I thought was pretty funny. So he gets rid of his cape. And eventually he becomes Captain America again. But in the second half of this book, look, it's Jack Kirby makes a return. There's Captain America, the Falcon, and Kissinger. You know, you never know who's going to show up in Captain America. But so Jack Kirby had returned to Marvel Comics after going to DC Comics, and one of the things he demanded when he returned to Marvel was to be able to write and draw Captain America. So not only is he doing the art in Captain America now, which is really good art. It's not the best Jack Kirby art at this point, but it's really, really good Jack Kirby, you know. But he's also writing the book. Jack Kirby was not the best comic book writer in the world. That's putting it kindly. He could come up with some good stories. He had good story ideas. Sometimes he just had weird story ideas, and you see a lot of that in this book. But he was an incredible talent. The most important figure in comic book history, I think. But he could not write. I mean, he desperately needed Stan Lee, I think, in these stories that he wrote. Man. But he could draw, just the writing. So this was that point. They're not quite as bad as the Black Panther issues that he did around this same time. But yeah, they're not that bad. But not great. Not great. But the art is good. So there's that. I mean, Jack Kirby artwork, that makes up for a lot. So I got that. And I also got a couple of comics that are comic book collections that I pre-ordered a long time ago. Finally starting to show up. In fact, the last of my pre-orders are starting to show up now. I think, yeah, I've got a few more and then that's it. And one of the things that came in was Atlas Comics Library number 2. So Atlas Comics was Marvel Comics in the 1950s. Before Marvel was Marvel, in the 1950s, it was Atlas. And one of the comics that came out was Venus. I actually ordered a few from the Atlas Comics Library, which is being printed right now. I either have one or two more of these coming. I know there's a War volume coming. I can't remember if there's another one. But this is Venus. And it's actually Venus Volume 2. You'd think, well, where's Volume 1? Volume 1 of Venus was actually published years ago, over 10 years ago, I think, back when Marvel Masterworks were doing an Atlas line, which they discontinued. And so they had Volume 1 of Venus, which, as a physical copy, is impossible to get now. I mean, you'd have to spend a lot of money to get Venus Volume 1. I have it as an e-copy. I don't have a physical copy of it. And so you might wonder, well, why, since it was so long ago that they printed Volume 1, why aren't they just reprinting that since nobody has it and it's impossible to get? Well, there's a reason. So Venus, this was a series of comics about Venus, the goddess of love, who comes to Earth and starts working on a magazine. And, you know, falls in love and has romance. And so Venus was originally a romance comic book. It was a lighthearted, breezy kind of romance comic. But this series took a strange turn. It like veered away from romance and became a horror comic book, which was the weirdest thing. So this volume, the reason they printed this is because this is where all the good stuff is. All the good stuff is in Volume 2, which I think is the last 10 issues of Venus. That's when this gets really weird. So we have a character, Venus, the goddess of love, who came to Earth, and it was a romance, and she's still the same character. Only now she's encountering aliens and spaceships and monsters. And in fact, in the back, they say, the goddess of love and horror, because it just inexplicably becomes a horror comic book. And Venus runs into one strange, bizarre thing after another, like the king of the living dead in this issue of Venus. And the artwork in this is awesome. Here we have the Fountain of Death, and we get all the original advertisements. And it's just, this is just a glorious volume. Here we have the House of Terror. There's Venus having to deal with the House of Terror. And it's great. There's some excellent stuff in this. Bill Everett, the great Bill Everett, who created the Submariner, does a lot of work in this. So, yeah, I'm really happy they published this. I'm glad they didn't just try to publish Volume 1 again. I mean, look at that. That's awesome. So, yeah, Venus Volume 2. It's very strange and very awesome. And this other book, which I've had on order forever, finally showed up. This is the Micronauts. The Micronauts Omnibus Volume 1 has all of these issues of the Micronauts. This is a series that has never been reprinted because it's licensed. The Micronauts were a bunch of toys. And it was a great comic book, though, particularly the first few issues. Has Bill Mantlo as the writer, and Michael Golden does the art. It's just great stuff. This was a great series. And Grammaticus, whom I mentioned earlier, actually, I believe Grammaticus did a whole video on the Micronauts. And they're going to print 3 omnibus volumes. I had the first one on order, and now I have it. Won't be able to get the next couple because of the 500 book challenge, you know. I have to be happy with the 1 volume I have of the Micronauts. But I'm glad to finally get this. Like I said, this has never been reprinted since, what, 1978? Let me see. Let me see when the first issue of the Micronauts came out. 1979. Yeah, Micronauts number 1. January 1979. So it came out when I was 8 years old. And I remember getting issues of the Micronauts and really liking that. And so finally, they reprinted the Micronauts. So that's fantastic. So I got that. And I don't think I got anything else. I don't think I read anything else. So that's everything. I will shut up now because I've been talking for a half hour. I'm sorry. Like I said, there was more stuff going on this week than usual. I will catch you next time.